Okay, chapter 9 in your medical assisting textbook. It is Anatomy and Physiology of the Human Body. This is a two-part lecture, so buckle up, let's go. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is what is anatomy? Anatomy is the study of the physical structure of the body and its organs. Anatomy describes the framework and physical characteristics, but then there's physiology, which explains how everything works together to support life. Anatomy has subsections. There's gross anatomy and microscopic anatomy. So gross anatomy is the study of features that are seen with your eye. You don't need a microscope to see them upon inspection or dissection. Microscopic anatomy, however, refers to features that can only be seen with a microscope, and it's further broken down into two subsections again. There's cytology and histology. Cytology is the study of cell life and formation, and we know that because CYT, that word part means cell. Histology is the study of the microscopic structure of tissues, and we know that because histo means tissue. Physiology is the science of the function of cells, tissues, and organs of the body. So you can see how they work together, anatomy and physiology. Physiology is the study of interrelationships of all the functioning structures of the body. There's homeostasis, which is when everything is in harmony and all biological indicators are within acceptable limits. Pathophysiology is the study of mechanisms by which disease occurs, and we can further break that down because patho means disease. It attempts to bring together the clinical signs and symptoms present within or with the knowledge of the effects of the disease process on the body. Going into a different section, we're going to talk about anatomical directional terms. So the body is said to be in the anatomic position when standing erect with arms down at the sides and the palms of the hands facing forward. You can see in the visual here, this person is standing straight up and down, hands out to the side, palms facing forward. When reference is made to a body structure, it is in relationship to this. So even though we're looking at this structure, and technically this is our right side facing them and this is our left side facing them, but in reality, this is their right side and this is their left side. Directional terms tell us where body parts are located with reference to the body in the anatomical position. So let's talk about these. So you have anterior, which is up, and posterior, which is forward, and posterior, which is back. They're also called ventral and dorsal. You need to be aware of these two terms. Anterior is the front of the body, posterior is the back of the body. Ventral is the front of the body, dorsal is the back of the body. Superior is referring to up, and inferior is referring to down. When we get into the cardiovascular system, we're going to learn about the inferior and superior vena cava, and you'll understand it better as in terms of direction when we talk about blood flow being delivered to the body and received from the lungs, etc. Then you have your medial line, which is the midline. It runs right down the middle of the body and breaks the body into two halves, right and left. Lateral is going to be the same thing, but from the back side, it's referring to the right and left sides. Proximal means closest to the point of attachment, and distal means furthest away from the point of attachment. And then you have superficial referring to tissue depth and deep referring to tissue depth. So the midline or the mid-sagittal plane divides the body vertically, splitting it into right and left sides, as you can see in the picture here. The middle line right down the middle, and then you have one side and another side. Relationship of extremities to the trunk of the body. So as I had mentioned in the other slide, proximal is nearness to the point of attachment, meaning it's the closest it's closer to the point of attachment than it is away from it. Distal is the distance away from the point of attachment. And you can see in this picture here what that's referring to. Then you have anterior versus posterior. So the frontal plane or coronal plane separates the body into front and back halves. Anterior or ventral. It is the front half of the body when separated by the frontal plane. You can see here, this line comes down the middle. This is anterior, this is posterior. Posterior or dorsal is the back half of the body when separated by the frontal plane. Transverse plane draws an imaginary line across the body horizontally, creating a transverse plane. Above the plane is known as superior or cephalic. Below the plane is known as inferior or caudal. About body cavities. So the body is divided into two main cavities, anterior or ventral cavity and posterior or dorsal cavity. You can see in this picture here, the dorsal cavity is in the back section and the ventral cavity is in the front section. Did you know that the diaphragm, a dome-shaped muscle, divides the anterior cavity into an upper thoracic cavity and a lower abdominopelvic cavity? The diaphragm alternately contracts and relaxes to remove the lungs, causing breathing to occur. If you've been in choir, you've been told to sing from your diaphragm. That's what this is kind of talking about. They're asking for depth and for you to really push that diaphragm so you get the most air into your lungs so that you can make the most sound. So in the dorsal cavity, you have two sections. You have the cranial cavity up here, which houses the brain, and then the vertebral cavity, which houses the spinal column. The thoracic cavity, the abdominopelvic cavity, these are all in the ventral section. So the thoracic cavity is your chest, and then the abdominal cavity is your intestinal tract, your GI, anything that does with digestion in that area. And then your pelvic cavity houses your reproductive organs. And this is divided here. Your diaphragm rests here. So here is your lungs and your heart section, and then your diaphragm rests here and it rises up and down as it contracts and relaxes to aid in breathing. The thoracic cavity houses a lot of pieces. So it has your heart, all of the pieces of the heart, the vena cava, the aortas, the right lung, the right auricle, the right atrium, the right ventricle, your ribs, and then the arch of the aorta, the pulmonary trunk, the left auricle, the left lung, left ventricle, and pericardial cavity, and the apex of the heart. We're going to learn a lot about the apex of the heart when we get into general patient care and we start doing vital signs, because we actually learn how to measure the beating of the heart by listening to the apex. Then it has your diaphragm and then the parietal pleura. You can see in this sagittal view, you have your trachea, your thymus, diaphragm, vena cava, esophagus, aortic arch, base, and thoracic artery, or aorta, sorry. Those are all part of the thoracic cavity. Your abdominopelvic cavity is separated into two parts, the upper abdominal and the lower pelvic. The kidneys are actually located in the dorsal abdominal area behind the peritoneum, so they don't qualify in sense of the abdominopelvic cavity because they're actually in the back. So you can see in this visual here, this shows you what is contained in the abdominopelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity has the false pelvis, the sacrum, the coccyx, the perineum, the greater pelvis, all the different parts of the reproductive systems and your urinary tract. The cranial and spinal section are on the dorsal portion of the body. The cranial cavity totally is encased by the bones of the skull and protects the brain. It's joined at the base by the spinal cavity. The spinal cavity extends through the center of the column of the vertebrae. So you can see here your spinal cord and then your brain encased in the cranium. These are part of the dorsal cavity. And then you have even further the abdominal regions. So we call these the right hypochondriac region, which is up here. Chondr means rib. So when you're talking about right hypochondriac, it means below the ribs. Your epigastric region, which means above the stomach. And then you have your left hypochondriac region. And then you have your right lumbar region, your umbilical is referring to your belly button. So you have your umbilical region and then the left lumbar region. And then there's the right iliac region, hypogastric region, meaning below the stomach, and the left iliac region. Remember when I said a few slides ago that when you're looking at the human body, even though this looks like the right side, it's actually the person's left side. And this is how, and this is how we should be viewing our patients. I'm going to switch over to our other presentation that's located in Classroom, Anatomic Descriptors and the Fundamental Structure of the Body. Now, this is the presentation that's directly associated with your textbook. It's the same information, but it's presented a little bit differently. So I'd like to go through both of them with you. So anatomy and physiology defined again. Anatomy is the study of the physical structure of the body and its organs. It describes the framework and physical characteristics, whereas physiology is the science of the function of cells, tissues, and organs of the body. It explains how everything works together to support life. And anatomical direction terms, we talked about these. We're going to go over them again just for learning purposes. Certain directional terms are universally used in describing anatomic structures. A body is said to be in the anatomical position when the patient is standing erect with arms down at the sides and palms of the hands facing forward. I encourage you at home or whenever you're listening to this to stand up and take this stance just to kind of help you connect the two and remember this. Anatomic directional terms describes what location, charting, the body is divided by imaginary lines. One line divides the body into right and left. We know that's the mid-sagittal or the median or the midline. You can see that here. And then lateral refers to the outside, inside of the joints in this image. And proximal means closest to the point of attachment, etc. Medial toward the midline, proximal nearest the point of attachment, distal farthest from the point of attachment, and lateral away from the midline. These are really important to know. You will be expected to understand these and be able to use these terms appropriately throughout this lab the next year and a half. Appropriate terminology for anatomical directions. So another line divides the body into upper and lower halves. We know this is the transverse plane. Remember, cephalic means toward the head. That's the top of the transverse. Caudal means toward the feet, which is below the transverse. And then you have your mid-sagittal, which divides into halves, right and left. And then you have your frontal plane, which is the front half of the body, and then your posterior or dorsal plane, which is the back. Terms again, anterior toward the front, frontal toward the front, ventral toward the front or belly side, superior above the transverse plane, cranial toward the head, inferior below the transverse plane, caudal toward the tail or feet, posterior toward the back. Body cavities and organs again. The body is divided into two main cavities, anterior or ventral, posterior or dorsal. The diaphragm is a large dome-shaped muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity and aids in respiration. Body cavities and organs. You've seen these images on other slides in the previous presentation, but let's go over them again. Whoops, sorry. Let's go over them again. Posterior, it contains your cranial and spinal, actually also your kidneys. And then you've got anterior or ventral, which contains your thoracic cavity and your abdominopelvic cavities. Of the abdomen, the stomach, small intestine, most of the large intestine, liver, spleen, pancreas, and gallbladder reside. The regions of the abdomen, because of its size, are divided into four sections. We call them quadrants. So you have the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, here's the belly button, which we call the umbilicus, the right lower quadrant, and the left lower quadrant. This is used to identify where symptoms are occurring so that diagnostic testing can be completed to ensure that the right organ is being identified. The regions of the abdomen, there's 9 regions for purposes of identification. You have epigastric, we talked about this in the other presentation, right hypochondriac, left hypochondriac, your belly button, and then your umbilical region, which is the umbilicus and umbilical region, right lumbar, left lumbar, right iliac, hypogastric, pubic, and then the left inguinal or iliac. The cell, so this is where we're getting into a little bit more diagnostic information. So the cell is the basic building block of the human body. It needs nutrients and oxygen to survive. It performs specific functions, produces heat and energy, can give off waste products, and some can even reproduce themselves. It is composed of a fluid called cytoplasm and is surrounded by a cell membrane. This membrane separates the cell from the surrounding environment, and the cytoplasm, that fluid, is a semi-solid fluid within the membrane where chemical reactions like respiration can occur. Then there's the organelles. Within the cytoplasm of the cell are many minute bodies called organelles. The nucleus, the mitochondria, ribosomes, and centrioles, endoplasmic reticulums, Golgi apparatus, and lysosomes. This is important information. You really do need to be aware of this, and I encourage you to review the cell handout that's on Classroom to help you see and understand better what's contained inside of the cell. So with regard to these organelles, they physically separate, some of them physically separate the chemical reactions that are not compatible. They also can control the time when reactions take place. To give you an example of this, by producing or processing a molecule in one organelle and then later using the molecule in another reaction. This is really scientific information, and it's further explained in your textbook if you have additional questions, or you can reach out to me. Chromosomes are located within the nucleus, which is like the powerhouse of your cell. Each human has 23 pairs of chromosomes that store the hereditary material passed from one generation to the next. 22 pairs are identical. The 23rd pair are the sex chromosomes. XY equals male, and the double X equals female. Genes this is really complicated information, so I understand if it can be confusing, and I encourage you to really review this through your textbook and reach out if you have questions. But genes, every individual has a different DNA code. It is identical in all cells of the same individual. The arrangement of the base pairs of the DNA that makes for the differences is part of the genes. Division of cells is known as mitosis, controlled by the nucleus of the cell as well. Passing molecules through cell membranes, there are 6 processes by which materials pass through a cell membrane: diffusion, osmosis, filtration, active transport, phagocytosis, and pinosyntosis or pinosyntoses. You can say that either way. So with more information on passing molecules, let's talk a little bit more in depth about what these do. So diffusion is for gases or solids or liquids that are distributed evenly through a medium. Osmosis is the diffusion of water or another solvent through a selectively permeable membrane, which means it only lets certain things in and out. Filtration is the movement of solutes in water across a semi-permeable membrane, and filtration occurs as a result of force, such as gravity or blood pressure. Active transport is where molecules move across a membrane from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. Phagocytosis is where white blood cells become phagocytes and engulf bacteria, cell fragments, or damaged cells. The medical term phago, P-H-A-G-O, actually means to eat. And then pinosyntosis, cells engulf large molecules of liquid material. It's called cell drinking. It's pretty interesting stuff. Cellular division, so mitosis is the division of cells, and it is controlled by the nucleus. The sex cell gamete is responsible for reproduction. During meiosis, the ovum from the female and the spermatozoon from the male each reduce their respective 46 chromosomes to 23, 1/2 the normal amounts. When fertilization occurs, the 2 cells combine to form a singular cell called a zygote. Zygotes will then have the full set of 46 chromosomes, 23 from each parent. The zygote will subsequently, by mitosis, divide again and again until the new being is fully developed. Homeostasis. So we talked about this a little bit in the first presentation. It's the definition of it is when the internal environment is functioning properly and all the organs and tissues of the body are performing their appropriate tasks. A stable condition of the internal environment is homeostasis, and it continues until one or more of the control systems loses their ability to maintain it. So talking about DNA again, mutations and traits, DNA that is lost, rearranged, or paired in error results in a change in the genetic code called a mutation. Genetic mutations can be caused by internal or external factors. A mutation is a change in a cell resulting from a chemical and/or viral change in the structure of the gene. Dominant genes can produce a trait without regard to the nature of its pair member. Recessive gene is one whose presence within the pair does not result in recognizable traits unless both members of the gene pair are of a similar mutation. People who have one dominant and one recessive gene are known as carriers. Sex or X-linked defective gene is carried on the X chromosome. Multifactorial, so the combined influence of number of genes and environmental factors causing a trait to be expressed. And then there's chromosomal abnormalities, the result of either a group of genes occurring in excess or as a deficit of genetic materials. So in this chapter, you're going to be doing your disease project, and you're going to be starting your disease folder. So you're going to be picking 5 of the lists, and we'll go through this in class, and I'll make a presentation on this by itself also. But just be aware that these are some of the congenital disorders or genetic disorders that you might be choosing to do your presentations on. So there's the cleft lip, which is a structural defect present in the upper lip caused by failure of the soft or bony tissues to unite during the 8th to 12th week of gestation. The cleft palate is a structural defect present in the roof of the mouth caused by a failure of the soft or bony tissue to unite, again, during the 8th to 12th week of gestation. Another genetic or congenital disorder would be color vision deficiency, and accurately called color blindness. Most people see some colors. The most common problem is an inability to distinguish between red and green. There is no treatment to correct the problem. Most people learn to compensate, but they have created these spectrum glasses that you can put on that can help you see, see the colors when you wear them. And then there's cystic fibrosis. It affects multiple systems. It's a generalized dysfunction of the exocrine glands. 30,000 people are affected in the United States. A median age of survival is up to 37 years, which has actually gone up. It used to be less than that. All states require infant screening to identify cystic fibrosis before leaving the hospital, and currently there is no cure. Down syndrome is a genetic syndrome caused by improper cell division, and it occurs at about 1 in every 1,000 births, depending on the mother's age. The result is an extra chromosome 21. Down syndrome also has several physical characteristics. An example, slanting eyes, large tongue, pug nose, and a small head. Mental retardation occurs in all cases, and there is some degree of growth restriction. Then there's dwarfism, a condition that results in abnormally short or undersized persons. About 200 conditions that result in dwarfism. Achondroplastic dwarfism accounts for 70% of those cases. Galactosemia is an inherited metabolic disorder involving the process of a simple sugar called galactose as is present in milk and milk products into glucose. Infants will fail to thrive within 1 week of birth unless galactose and lactose are removed from their diet. Hemochromatosis is another genetic condition of iron overload in the body. Common genetic disorder affecting approximately 5 out of every 1,000 people. Most prevalent in Caucasians of Northern European descent. Hemophilia, the sex-linked inherited pattern caused by a defect in the gene located on the X chromosome that is involved in the production of blood clotting factors. I believe that would be 5, so 4, 3, 2, or 9, I think. A male with the abnormal gene on his X chromosome will have hemophilia. A female must have the gene on both her X chromosomes to have the disease. It is more common in men. It is not very common in women. Genetic and congenital disorders continued. So we're going to talk about Klinefelter syndrome. This is a sex-linked disorder caused by 1 or more extra X chromosomes resulting from abnormal meiosis. It affects about 1 in every 600 males. At puberty, the penis and testicles fail to mature and there is little body hair. Breasts may enlarge and long legs with a short, obese trunk are noted. Phenylketonuria. Phenylketonuria is devastating. It's genetically metabolic disease requiring an early intervention to prevent its development and progress. It is characterized by the presence of phenylpyruvic acid in the urine to the failure of the body to oxidize the amino acid phenylalanine. I can't say it. You can say it. Phenylalanine. I can't say it. Sorry. All right. So spina bifida, a structural malformation of the spine. The posterior portion of the spinal tissues fails to close during the first 3 months of pregnancy. Malformations occur in 3 forms: spina bifida occulta, meningocele, and myelomeningocele. And then there's talipes, which is the structural deformity of one or both feet, commonly called clubfoot. There may be varying degrees of inward, outward, downward, or upward turning of one or both feet. Turner syndrome is a sex-linked defect that affects about 1 in every 10,000 females. Only 45 chromosomes are present because the sex cells fail to divide correctly. Ovaries fail to develop, the chest is wide, poor breast development, and underdevelopment of genitalia. So because the body is so dependent on multiple systems to function, when diseases and disorders develop, often multiple systems are involved. In your textbook, Table 9-3 summarizes the systems involved and the pathology that is present in 2 examples of the genetic disease or disorder. There are also age-related body characteristics. So a person with a genetic or congenital disorder may have age-related characteristics associated with their disorder. Their life expectancy is shortened, so aging is not a significant factor. Early diagnosis and intervention prevents the development of many of the devastating effects of the disorders. You can see Table 9-3 in your textbook for more information on age-related body characteristics. And then there's discovery in human genetics. Human Genome Project identified a 3 billion letter code of human DNA, which is the chemical sequence containing the basic information for building and running a human body. The sequence determines every human characteristic from eye color to vulnerability to disease. In regard to that, there are some new genetic techniques. There's the polymerase chain reaction, DNA fingerprinting, genetic counseling, gene therapy, genetic engineering, and stem cell research. If you recall from chapters 3 and 4 when we were talking about law and ethics, some of these are actually considered ethical dilemmas because they can be considered, people say that it's like playing God by doing stem cell therapy and gene therapy, etc. Tissues. When cells of the same type group together for a common purpose, they form a tissue. So opposites of tissue fluid balance would be dehydration and edema. Tissue classifications are epithelial, connective, nerve, and muscle, and we'll talk more about these too when we get into the integumentary system. But epithelial tissue forms the body's glands, covers the surface of the body, and lines the cavities. Connective tissue forms the supporting structure of the body, connecting other tissues together to form the organs and body parts. Connective tissue proper is supportive, connective tissue fluid, connective tissue. There's all different kinds. There is nerve tissue, which is found throughout the body. It serves as the body's communication network. It's the basic structural unit of the tissue is the neuron. There are 3 types of neurons: sensory, interneuron, and connecting neuron. Muscle, again, we'll talk about these in depth when we get into each body system, but tissue that can be controlled at will with impulses from the brain is called voluntary muscle tissue. It's connected to the bones of the body, and it's called skeletal or striated muscle. Involuntary muscle action occurs without control or conscious awareness, which is smooth or cardiac. I don't think you would want to have control over when your heart beats because we'd probably all die, right? Luckily, it's a smooth muscle or cardiac muscle, so it's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. We don't have to tell our heart to beat. Organ systems of the body are made of 2 or more types of tissue that work together to perform a specific function. Organs of the body that perform similar functions are organized into systems, and all systems must combine their individual contributions for the health and well-being of the total human body. So you can see here in this graphic, it shows you the cell, the tissue, organs, the system, respiratory, and then the body, and how it all works together. I hope this helps. Let me know if you have questions.